Look, let's just acknowledge right up front why you're probably tuning into this explainer. Facing the reality of a terminally ill or severely injured goldfish, it's incredibly difficult. For a lot of us, these little guys aren't just display animals, right? They're pets. They rely on us for absolutely everything. And making the decision to end their suffering, that carries a really heavy emotional weight. So today, our goal is simple. We're going to empower you with the clearest, most scientifically backed information out there. That way, if you ever have to make this really tough choice, you can do it with total confidence, compassion, and above all, absolute care.
Now, if you've spent any time at all in aquarium hobbyist circles, you've almost certainly run into a massive debate around this one central question. Is clove oil actually the most humane way to say goodbye? You'll hear these incredible, peaceful success stories, and then, unfortunately, you'll hear about some really distressing failures. So today, we're cutting through the noise. We're going to look directly at veterinary guidelines, university studies, and aquatic welfare standards to separate fact from fiction. We're going to find out exactly how and why this method actually works.
I really want to ground our discussion with this powerful concept from the RSPCA. They remind us that the word euthanasia literally translates from Greek to mean a good death. Providing a peaceful ending is an absolutely crucial part of animal welfare. Honestly, it's the final act of kindness we can offer to an animal that's in pain. And understanding this, it kind of shifts the burden from something that's purely tragic to a profound responsibility.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our quick roadmap for the explainer. First, the hardest choice and the methods to avoid. Second, why clove oil is scientifically recommended. Third, the secret to safe preparation. Fourth, a step-by-step humane procedure. And finally, confirming a peaceful passing. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The hardest choice, and specifically, methods to avoid.
Right off the bat, we absolutely need to debunk some persistent, frankly dangerous myths. The Ornamental Aquatic Trade Association, or OATA for short, explicitly lists unacceptable, cruel methods that, unfortunately, are still tossed around online. Freezing, flushing down the toilet, or asphyxiation by just taking the fish out of the water. These are agonizing ways for a fish to die. On the flip side, we have the humane methods, specifically an anesthetic overdose, like clove oil. Our entire goal here is to ensure a smooth transition from consciousness to unconsciousness with zero pain or distress.
Moving on to Section 2. Why choose clove oil? Let's look at the scientific rationale.
So physical methods of euthanasia, like percussive stunning, they do exist, and they're used in commercial fisheries. But institutions like OATA make it very, very clear. For ornamental fish at home, a chemical anesthetic overdose is the way to go. Why? Well, physical methods require extreme skill and precision. If you get it wrong, it causes immense suffering. Chemical methods, on the other hand, when applied correctly, just gently shut down the central nervous system. It's much safer for the pet.
And this brilliantly illustrates the science behind picking clove oil specifically. There was this fascinating study out of the University of British Columbia where they tested how fish reacted to different anesthetics. They took a very common lab chemical called MS-222 and compared it against clove oil. Through this really clever behavioral test, they found that fish actually learned to avoid the environment where they were exposed to MS-222. They showed a really strong aversion to it. Clove oil, though, much less evidence of aversion. So science literally tells us it's far less stressful for the fish.
All right, Section 3. The secret is preparation. This is all about safe application. Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive contradiction you'll find online. If you search for clove oil on forums like Reddit, you're going to see a glaring divide. Some aquarists report this beautifully peaceful drift to sleep, while others are completely traumatized because their fish thrashed violently. So why the huge difference? Well, it comes down entirely to user error and basic chemistry. Clove oil isn't just some magical drop you squeeze straight into a tank. It requires a very specific chemical preparation to work properly.
So the absolutely crucial point here is a process called emulsification. Remember, clove oil is an essential oil. Think about what happens when you mix oil and water. They repel each other, right? If you just drop it straight into cold aquarium water, it will not mix. It's just going to float there in these localized, highly concentrated droplets on the surface. And if a fish swims through that concentrated droplet, it actually burns their gills. It causes panic, pain, thrashing, the whole shebang. To prevent this, the oil must be emulsified. That means vigorously mixing it into a small amount of warm water or ethanol first so it can distribute evenly and gently into the water column.
We can actually look to clinical standards to see just how strictly this is handled by the pros. Take the standard operating procedure at Algoma University, for example.
They require mixing clove oil with ethanol in a precise 9-to-1 ratio. This ensures it dissolves perfectly before it ever even touches the water the fish is swimming in. Now, at home, you might just use warm water instead of ethanol in a pinch, but the core principle is exactly the same. Absolute dissolution is required for a painless process.
Section 4. Step-by-step humane euthanasia. Let's walk through the actual procedural guide.
Let's move to and see how this builds into the actual dosing. Because, look, to achieve euthanasia, rather than just putting the fish into a light sleep, you have to use a lethal dose. The RSPCA recommends 0.4 milliliters per liter of water. OATA simplifies this to roughly 10 drops per liter. And keep in mind this is drastically higher than the dose a vet might use just to temporarily knock a fish out for a quick exam.
Okay, here is the absolute, non-negotiable process. Step 1. Emulsify that specific dose of clove oil in a small jar of warm water. You want to shake it vigorously until it turns a milky white color. Step 2. Gently place your goldfish in a separate, clean bucket filled with water from their own tank. And step 3. Honestly, this is the most important part of the entire explainer. You have to add that milky mixture to the bucket slowly, over a full 5-minute period. Seriously, do not dump it all in at once. Slowly adding it introduces a mild sedative effect first. The fish will just peacefully fall asleep. As you slowly continue adding the rest over those 5 minutes, that sleeping fish simply transitions into an anesthetic overdose without ever waking up.
Finally, Section 5, confirming a peaceful passing. How we go about avoiding tragic mistakes.
It is incredibly common for owners to feel a ton of deep anxiety at this stage. I mean, how do you actually know if the fish is truly gone, or if they're just heavily sedated and unconscious? Because fish biology is honestly so resilient and their oxygen needs can slow down dramatically, we have to look for some very specific biological markers to be sure.
We absolutely must follow the strict veterinary standard for confirmation here. First, the goldfish will lose its balance and probably roll onto its side. That's stage 4 anesthesia. They're totally unconscious. Next, their opercular, or gill, movement will slow down and eventually just stop. But here is the critical rule from the American Veterinary Medical Association and the RSPCA. You must wait a minimum of 10 to 30 minutes after all gill movement has completely stopped. Do not, I repeat, never assume death just because the fish is floating or unresponsive to touch. Just wait the time.
Once you are absolutely 100% certain the fish is passed, proper disposal is the final step. As noted by the University of Notre Dame and OATA, please do not flush the fish down the toilet. All that does is introduce biological waste and concentrated essential oils right into the water system. Plus, because the fish's tissues now contain clove oil, you really need to prevent it from being scavenged by other animals. Following your local waste guidelines or doing a safe, deep burial in the yard is highly recommended.
As we wrap up this explainer, I really want to bring us back to this RSPCA quote. Euthanasia of animals to end suffering and pain is widely accepted as an important component of safeguarding their welfare. Look, if you follow these structured steps, if you took the time to measure, emulsify, and administer that oil slowly, you performed an act of profound care. You essentially replaced days or even weeks of suffering with a peaceful drift to sleep.
I'll leave you with this final thought. By taking the time to truly understand the science of a good death, how much unnecessary suffering can we prevent for the pets who rely on us entirely? It is definitely not an easy topic to learn about, but your focus and your willingness to understand this process, that makes you an incredibly responsible and compassionate caretaker. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer and for taking your pet's welfare so seriously. Take care.